So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rodrigo Caye, and I'm here today to present to you my thesis work titled Convolutional Neural Networks for Change Analysis in Earth Observation Images with Noisy Labels and Domain Shifts. I developed this work at ONER here and at Telecom Paris under the guidance of Yang Bousseau, Bertrand Lesaut, and Alexandre Bauche. So for those of you who are here present with me today, you're probably going to recognize these images. This is where we are right now. This is the Fort de Palaiseau, which used to be a fort, and now it's the research center of ONER. And you can see the development of this terrain throughout the years since 1937. And you can see that there's a lot of information that we can extract from these images by looking at how things evolved in this region. So these images contain a lot of this information, and what we want here is to extract this information on how things changed over time. Also nowadays, there are several systems to obtain a lot of information about the Earth, several satellites and aerial surveys. So here's a pair of images taken from Las Vegas in 2015 and 2018. And you can see, for example, the urban expansion between the two images. But the problem is that not all data can be analyzed manually by experts. First, because it's impossible to keep up with the data that is coming in from these satellites. They are able to image just the Sentinel-2 satellites. They're able to image all of the land masses of the Earth every 5 days around. And also some applications require fast outputs. So for example, here, these are 3 images taken about a month apart from last year's fire in Australia. And in situations like these, it's very useful to be able to extract the information of how things are going very fast so that we can coordinate a response. Here's another pair of images that show another fire with a bit more resolution. This one happened in the US, and you can probably see the foundations of the houses that were burned to the ground. So what we want is to extract this information automatically from these images so that we can do this very fast and at large scale. More specifically, what we're going to be tackling here is the problem of change detection. And we're going to be, to define what parts of the image have been changed between a pair of images. And then we're going to tackle this as a semantic segmentation problem. So we're going to try to assign a label to each pixel in a pair of images. And in the simplest case, this label is binary, which just classifies between has it been changed or not. The main tool we're going to be using for this task is convolutional neural networks. In the recent years, these techniques have exploded, mainly due to an increase in computational power and also an increase in the amount of available data. Both of these things are kind of the foundations to enable large-scale convolutional neural networks to achieve a good performance. So why are we using CNNs? They are very good for semantic segmentation problems. They are the state of the art. They are able to harness all this data. And also they are very fast at inference time. So once they are trained, they are very fast to produce results given new images. There are a few weaknesses that we're going to explore later on, such as the dependence on properly labeled images. Good ground truth is essential. And the CNNs, they also struggle a little bit when the data used at inference time is too different from the data that was used for training. So it can struggle to generalize in some cases. The structure of the work I'm going to present to you today, first I'm going to kind of take what existed when I started the thesis in terms of CNNs and apply it to change detection. So we're going to use CNNs trained from scratch to perform change detection. Also, we're going to look into the semantics of these changes and try to understand them a little bit better. But then it became clear after about my first year of thesis that the main problem with this task is the quality of the data that was available for me. So first, we're going to look at data noise and label complexity and weakly supervised methods for change detection. And so we're going to be looking really at the quality of the labels. And then we're going to look a little bit into like problems in the image part of the data and some domain adaptation methods to solve some of these problems. So we just went through the introduction. Then I'm going to present all these three parts that I just mentioned, and then we're going to conclude this presentation. So now for supervised change detection with convolutional neural networks. As I said before, convolutional neural networks, they need data for being trained. And the case we're looking at here, it's the supervised case where we need inputs and outputs or labels. So the first thing I did in this thesis was to generate a data set that was used for training and testing the proposed algorithms. We used open images from the Sentinel-2 satellites, which are, they cover the whole world, so we can get many different terrains. And it's also multispectral data, which we're going to see later. It's pretty useful in some cases. So this was all labeled manually to produce pixel labels at a pixel level for all the pixels in the dataset. And the focus of this dataset is urban changes. There is a problem, which is it's not always clear what the label should be when you're labeling these things, these images manually. So as you can see in A and B, the change is pretty obvious. But in C and D, I tried to find an example that it's not exactly clear if it is a change or not, and if it is a change, exactly where are the boundaries of this change. To show this better, we took a pair of images and we gave it to 3 people to label to create change maps. And you can see in C in different color channels the 3 produced the 3 produced change maps by these 3 people. And you can see everything that's colorful means there is some level of disagreement. So this is just to say that there is no perfect ground truth. There is always a level of failure in these labels. We also tried to stay perfectly impartial to use OpenStreetMap data to produce these change maps. The problem is that the OpenStreetMap, for those of you who don't know, it's kind of like Google Maps, but open source and crowdsourced by so people can submit new objects to these maps. And so what we tried to do is to generate rasters from these vector data and to compare these two. The problem is that it's very hard to align the dates of the satellite images and the OpenStreetMap. And even if you do, the OpenStreetMap data is not necessarily perfect to the images of those dates. It depends on people to add in the new objects that are built or destroyed. And also sometimes they just make small modifications to the objects that already exist, and these come as changes. So you can compare the change maps in C is the one that was made manually, and in F, the one that was generated with this technique, and this was not successful. But yeah, so we ended up just labeling everything manually. Then when it comes to the architecture of the networks that were proposed, these are all based on the UNet architecture, for those of you who know. It's a fully convolutional encoder-decoder architecture. And so the first one is depicted in A is just kind of a small version of the UNet, just because we have fewer training data. But the problem is here we're not dealing with one image as input. We're dealing with 2. So the first option and most intuitive, I'd say, is to just concatenate the color channels to produce, for example, if it's 2 Rgb images, a 6 color channel image as input, and just let the network learn the tasks. And then we also tried a fully convolutional Siamese approach, where the images are given to identical branches but separately, and then they are processed by these branches, and then they are concatenated when they go into the decoder, and they are decoded simultaneously to produce the change map. When we're looking at the skip connections that are that were proposed by the UNet authors, that usually they just concatenate the activations from the encoder layers to the decoder layers. But here, since we have two encoders in parallel, there are two ways that we explored how to do this. One is to just concatenate both of them, and the other one is to concatenate actually the magnitude of the difference of the activations. In this way, we're specifically looking for changes or differences in these activations. So we're using more of the heuristics specific to this problem. Here you can see just quickly, if the quality permits, just the qualitative results that we obtained. So all three architectures were successful to a point in performing change detection. Everything that's white and black is correctly labeled, and everything that's colored is incorrectly labeled. But if we're looking at some quantitative results first, if we're looking at the case with Rgb images, which are the more the images that most people are used to. So here you can see that the accuracy is pretty high. It's about 94 for all the approaches. The F1 score, which is a harmonic mean between precision and recall, it's pretty good. The first two lines, there are some other earlier architectures that I do not have the time today to explain, but it's just some simpler versions of this one. And then if we're looking at the multispectral data, because the Sentinel-2 satellites, they contain also infrared and ultraviolet bands, we can see that also the proposed architectures, they achieve like 95, 96% of accuracy and even higher F1 scores. If we're looking at the F1 scores, these are the same values that I just showed you before, but in a way to make clear that the difference between the performance using Rgb images and multispectral images. We can see that in every test case, using multispectral data improves the results. So this is something useful to know if there is more available bands, it's useful to use that. And this kind of justifies why we're training these networks from scratch, because a lot of people before I started doing this, they used transfer learning for this, for change detection sometimes. There are other techniques that have been proposed. But if you're doing transfer learning, the weights that have been learned, they are specific to Rgb images, because that's kind of all the data sets in computer vision, especially the large ones. And this way we have full control. We just need like enough data, and it's not even that much. It's enough that pretty much was labeled in 1 or 2 weeks of work. And we're able to train these networks for change detection. Also, we trained our models in another data set to compare with other state-of-the-art methods. Our results are in the bottom, but it's hard to exactly get a feeling of how well we're doing. So quantitatively, you can see once again that in F1 score, we beat all the other results. And in accuracy, we're doing very well, over 90% in both test cases. We only lost in precision in one case because probably recall was sacrificed to increase the precision of the SCCN method. This kind of serves as a proof of concept that we can do this in a supervised way with neural networks, but how can we improve what has been done? So we try to go forward in two main ways. One is resolution. Instead of using images that are 10 meters per pixel, we move to images that are 50 centimeters per pixel, so about 20 times higher resolution. And we try to extract semantics from the changes that are detected. So it's more useful, instead of just to detect the changes, but to understand what happened here. Is this like a loss of water in this river, or maybe is it a building that appeared or something? For this, we created another data set that is much higher in scale, much larger. We combined two open data sets, which is IGN's BD-Ortho, which contains the images for several urban areas in France at this resolution. This is aerial images now and Rgb. And we also used the Urban Atlas change from 2006 to 2012 for vectorial labels. so that we could create rasters for not only change maps, but land cover maps. And you can see some statistics on the dataset. It's much larger than everything that was available at the time. And it also contains this multitask side of containing the land cover maps and the semantics of the changes. So this is an example of images that you could find in the dataset. So it's a pair of images with associated land cover maps showing if it's urban area or agricultural area or a forest or something, and also an associated change map to the pair of images. So this is a real world scenario, which means the data is imbalanced. So some classes are much more represented than some of the others. And this is important to take into account when we're dealing with the dataset. Otherwise, the algorithms are probably not going to work. And this becomes much more apparent when we're looking at the class distribution of changes. So 99.2% of the pixels are marked as not change. And most of the changes are concentrated in the first column, the second value, as you can see, which is changes from agricultural areas to urban areas, meaning urban expansion. So it's not surprising, but it's very hard to deal with this. How could we do this? There are two naive approaches that I'd say most people would try as their first approach. One is to produce two land cover maps and then compare these two. This way, where the classes are different, you can say there was a change. And also, you can say like the class from and to, like in the first image and the second image, you can say what type of change it was. You can also model this, as is depicted on the right, as a semantic segmentation or co-segmentation problem, where you just feed the two images as input and you model this as a 21 class problem in this case. And you just try to predict you assign one class for each of the possible cases that you're considering. We're going to look later why these are not good solutions. But the main idea that was proposed here by me was to use a single multitask network to produce land cover maps and the change map. And then we can combine these predictions to obtain the semantic change detection map. So this network is multitask. It uses residual blocks and then in an encoder-decoder way. So it's also based on UNet, but it uses residual blocks. And it's also fully convolutional, which is the best approach in this case for semantic segmentation tasks. Here you can see some qualitative results. The first line, you can see the pair of images and the ground truth. In D, the land cover map comparison, you can see there's a lot of false positives. That's because the errors in the land cover maps are multiplied, kind of whatever errors it makes on the first one or the second one, unless it's the same kind of error, they're going to come out as false positives as changes. In E, you can see the result from the co-segmentation approach, just like as if it was a semantic segmentation network. And it's very similar to F and G, which is the multitask approach. The difference between F and G is that there's two ways of training this network. I don't have the time to go into this now. I can answer some questions later, but the best one is the last one, the sequential way of training. The predictions, they seem pretty similar, but there is a problem with E, which is while it was about as good as the other ones in detecting the changes, all the changes that it predicted were of the main class of changes, from agricultural areas to urban areas, which defeats the purpose of the whole semantic side of this algorithm. This is the predicted land cover maps, and you can see that the last one is the best in this case. And so the multitask network was able to predict the land cover maps that was used to extract the semantics from the change. So here you can see it went from orange or agricultural area to blue or urban area. So we can deduce that it was a building that appeared in this region, in the center of the image. For some quantitative results, if you look at first at CD or change detection, the total accuracy of our methods is pretty high. It gets up to like 98%. But given the class imbalance of this dataset, a few false positives can really bring the DICE or the kappa scores really strongly down. But still, in this case, the multitask approach was the better one. Also, it's basically as good as the land cover mapping as the dedicated network. This way, because it's kind of the same architecture, it's just it has also the change detection branch. So the difference are just because of the randomness of the training. Okay, so now to address a little bit a few problems that probably you have noticed on the images that I just showed you. The dataset that we created was not only automatically generated, so there are a few false positives and false negatives in the dataset, but also the labels, they are usually too large because they are at a parcel level. So inside a parcel or a terrain, if there was one change that happened, everything was going to be marked as a change. So the changes were the markings were always a bit too large. And then the consequence of this was that the network cannot really guess where humans draw imaginary lines. So it was good at detecting the changes, but it always predicted a bit too much change around the new object. So what we're trying here to do is to kind of make more precise predictions of changes around the objects and ignore all this, try to remove these extra predictions. And here we're going to borrow a few ideas from the weakly supervised learning field. For those of you, just a quick introduction for those of you who never heard of it. Weakly supervised learning is when your source of supervision is less complex than what you're trying to predict. So for example, if you have like an image label and you're trying to predict semantic segmentation, so a label for each pixel of the image, you're trying to go beyond what the supervision is available. So we're going to be working here for now. So it's a parallel between bounding box label and pixel level prediction, sorry. And why are we doing this? Because here you can see, like, for example, an ImageNet bounding box. And inside the box, the information that we have is that there is a fox there, but not all the pixels inside this box belong to the fox. Some of them are grass or maybe other things. But there are methods that try to extract information from this while ignoring the false information, let's say. And here we're doing a parallel with this. Because we have polygons, it's not a bounding box, but it's also kind of overly large markings of changes. And to solve this problem, what we proposed was an iterative training method for the network. It's just the same network that I presented just before, the multitask one, but we're focusing on the change detection part of it now. So we begin by just training the network with the labels that we have. And what we noticed is that both the predictions make mistakes, and the reference data that we have initially also contains mistakes, but they're not the same mistakes. So how can we combine this to extract to separate the good from the bad? Can we do that? So what we're doing here is to use the network predictions to clean the training data, which is kind of dangerous, but we're going to show that it works. We also do some post-processing to make the predictions fit better with the edges in the image. And then finally, we combine these two. We recalculate the class weights, and then we keep training with this new data that was generated. Notice here that we always refer back to the initial reference data. This is going to be important later. We propose 3 strategies to merge the predictions and the reference data. So you can see in C, for example, magenta depicts false negatives and green false positives. And kind of the true changes are in the intersection, the white part. But okay, so when we're going to do this for the next iteration of this procedure, how can we merge these two? We can kind of assume that all the changes are marked in both, and everything that's not marked in both the reference data and the prediction is not a change. So we just take the intersection. We can also have a few less extreme approaches that we mark some of these areas as an ignore class, that instead of saying these are not changes, we're just saying let's not use this during the training. We also proposed the guided anisotropic diffusion algorithm for post-processing. So here you can see just like an illustrative example of this working. We have a guide image with all the edges and details that we're trying to transfer into another image depicted in B, which is kind of like an approximate version of it, but we want to transfer the edges from the first to the second. So we use an algorithm that's based on the anisotropic diffusion, which is classic in image processing. But what you do is you kind of solve a heat equation for the pixel values on the image. But instead of having an isotropic heat equation, instead the coefficients for the heat transfer between pixels, it depends on the edges that are present in the image. And the idea here is to split where the coefficients are calculated and where the diffusion happens. So we're calculating the coefficients from the guide image, but we're diffusing the input image. That's the key idea here. And then you can see with more iterations, we are able to transfer mainly the edge details from the guide image to the target image. You need an approximate starting point, but in many cases it is able to do that task. Here you can see like a real example with the one we were seeing before. So in A and B, you see the image pair again. In C, you see the diffusion coefficients that are calculated from these images. In D is the softmax outputs for the change map that we obtain from the network. If we threshold it, we obtain E, which is the initial prediction. And then if we do this procedure to the softmax outputs, you can see the results in I, and you can see that the edges were transferred to this image. And then the final prediction, it fits much better with the boundaries in the original images. So that's what we're trying to do. This is an ideal case, but it works many times. And then with more iterations, it kind of diffuses more. This is a hyperparameter that needs to be tuned. But if chosen appropriately, we can get really good results. Now, if we move to the results, there is a problem, which is I just told all of you that we don't trust the data that we have. So how can we evaluate this? So the solution was to spend a lot of time manually labeling 2 of the images in the dataset to obtain very pixel accurate labels so that we can run some quantitative evaluations. The 2 main ones that I want to show you here, the first one is, remember before I told you there were 3 strategies to merge the network predictions with the reference data. And here we're comparing all 3 of them in blue, green, and orange. The dashed red line is just a baseline performance, which is the network just trained for the same amount of iterations and epochs, but without the whole framework for cleaning the data. And we can see that all 3 strategies, they surpass the baseline easily. So the strategy is quite successful regardless of which strategy for merging the predictions that we use. And here, there is a comparison between using the reference data and using this combination with just using the network predictions to train itself. So not referring to the original data. And we can see that there is a decrease in performance that's quite sharp since the beginning, because the network is just trying to learn what it already knows, and then it kind of forgets with the training. It's just, it degrades the performance. Here you can see some results for the complete pipeline. And you can see that the initial result in D was, I mean, it detected the change, but it kind of overmarked the edges. And if you look at E, I hope the quality is good enough, but the contours are much better, and especially on the bottom right image where the path is like perfectly marked as a change. So this is pretty good. This is using the whole framework and the guided anisotropic diffusion as a post-processing algorithm in the final results. So here we were looking at bounding box supervision kind of and pixel level predictions. Now we're going to look at like truly weakly supervised change detection, which as far as I know had never been done before. in such a way. So there is a data set created by some other authors with images before and after a tsunami. And each image pair contains a label to say, has the building at the center of the patch been destroyed by the tsunami? But what we're trying to do is to learn from this data and perform semantic segmentation. How do we do this? So there is the class activation mapping technique that it's able to use a branch of the network for classification. And then we have the labels, we can learn the necessary operations. And then if we skip the global average pooling operation, we're able to generate kind of a prediction per pixel using the same weights that have been learned from the classification branch. We also proposed a novel spatial attention network layer that allows the network to look at look closer at the parts of the image that it thinks is the most valuable, the most informative. And we're going to see later that this allows the network to learn more local features, which are excellent for semantic segmentation. So first, just analyzing the results for the classification. We compared with the original results from the authors of the dataset. And with the attention layer, and also we can post-process the attention layer with the guided anisotropic diffusion that I mentioned a few minutes ago, we achieve basically the same level of performance as the original authors with a simpler network, but just using this attention layer. So it's pretty a light framework, and it achieves a very good performance. But then it's also able to perform weakly supervised semantic segmentation. And here you can see in C is the result if we don't use the attention layer for training. So the network did not learn local features that were useful for semantic segmentation. So what it ends up doing is predicting the whole image as a change or not a change. And in D, you can see that if we are using the attention layer, the semantic segmentation becomes much more accurate, and it is able to predict different things for different pixels. And we can still post-process this with the guided anisotropic diffusion that I presented earlier to conform these predictions even more to the input images. Now, let's talk a little bit about the image side of the problems with the images. So data can vary significantly between different use cases. Here we can see 3 types of natural disasters. The first one is flooding, then wildfire, then tsunami again, but it's a different data set for tsunami. And we can see that these are kind of very different things if we're trying to detect destroyed buildings, which is what we have the data for here. In flooding, this inference is done mainly through the context of the building. So if we see there's now water everywhere around the building, it's probably being destroyed at some level. For wildfire, we can still see the foundations of the houses that have burned to the ground, but we can still see like their shadows. And in the tsunami case, most things just kind of disappear. So it's very hard to correlate one image to the other. So if you learn to perform change detection in one case, you're not necessarily gonna transfer very well to a different use case. So here, what are we trying to do? We're trying to find a common representation space for these images that we're able to arrive at either from the source domain, which is the one we're using for supervision, or the target domain, which is the one we don't have the supervision for, but we want to analyze these images. So we're trying to find a common representation space or latent space where the desired task or change detection, for example, can be performed. And what we're going to do for this is we're going to be basing ourselves in the Cyclegand Framework, which many of you may know. So the Cyclegand is used mainly for style transfers. So it has 2 different domains. The original one was, for example, they put images of horses on one side and zebras on the other side, and they were trying to translate horse images to, like, what if it was a zebra in this image? And the key idea here is that if you translate from one domain to the other and then back, you should obtain pretty much the same image if you're not losing any information. That's the cycle loss. And this is trained in an adversarial way because we don't really have a supervision of like an image with a horse and then exactly the same image with the zebra. So training this in an adversarial way, we're able to train this anyway. And we don't even need like pairs of images for this translation to happen. But the key idea for my contribution, first of all, is to look at the code that is produced in the center. This is going to be our latent representation space, is the encoded version of the image. And we don't need to learn any extra parameters here. We can use an L1 loss that kind of enforces that the code going forward and going backward are the same. Their distance is minimized. So the network learns the necessary operations to arrive at this representation space from either domain. And then using this representation, we learn a task. So for example, change detection. But it doesn't need to be change detection. When I formulated this, I realized that this was more general and nothing here is specific to change detection. So what I decided to do was to test this with other computer vision tasks. So first of all, let's look at classification. If any of you have already done CNNs, you've probably seen the MNIST dataset. It's the classic. That's the one that was used first for CNNs by Lecan. And there's also the USPS dataset and the Street View house number dataset. So MNIST and USPS are both handwritten digits, both black and white. The third one is pretty different from the other two, but we're trying to use one of them for supervision and then testing it on the other ones to see how it goes. Here you can see the results that we obtained. First of all, in two of the cases, the ones between handwritten digits, we got the best results among the compared methods. We did not successfully achieve the best results in the third case, but it's not horrible either. But the most interesting thing here is that in the first column, we're able to surpass target-only supervision if you pay attention to the DYNE method, which is the name we gave to this method. This is interesting because like MNIST has more images than USPS, so it's able to overfit less. And this is kind of the ideal situation. You have a domain where you have a lot of data and you're able to learn from it while the operations that you're learning are transferable to a different use case where you have fewer data to train with. Then we also tried this at semantic segmentation. In this case, what we're trying, the domain gap that we're trying to bridge is between simulated images and real images of cityscapes. Here you can see the difference between just source supervision with the simulated images. That's in the third column. And the last column is our results with the domain adaptation method. And you can see that it's much closer to the ground truth presented in B. So we are pretty successful here. The problem is that when we go into this area, we didn't have the computational power to compete, to train like the largest possible models and get competitive results. But we also noticed that the proposed domain adaptation methods in the state of the art, they kind of use whatever network they want, which makes it very hard to compare the methods. So what we did is we got some methods that we found the code for. We use the same backbone network for all of these methods, and in these tests, we obtained the best results. Finally, we also use this for change detection, so we're back to where we started, the three domains that I presented before. And you can compare the results in D and E. The last ones is without any unsupervised domain adaptation method. And D is DYNE, our proposed method. And our results are much closer to the original ground truth. So we are successful here to bridge this domain gap. Here are some more results. So this leads to a much more accurate segmentation of the changes, even though we have not seen these types of natural disasters in the training data. So in conclusion, let me just recap the main contributions in this thesis. The first one was using end-to-end trained CNNs from scratch. Before that, most works were doing CNNs with transfer learning, with one exception that I'm aware of, but they used a completely different type of framework. It was not end-to-end trained, but it was at least supervised. We also expanded fully convolutional architectures for semantic segmentation to this Siamese and multi-image inputs. We compared the results in Rgb and multispectral images, and we saw that there is an advantage in using these multispectral images. Finally, the dataset that we used here was released to the scientific community to serve as a benchmark and to properly compare different methods that are proposed by different authors. So it's completely open and online. Then we also proposed a multitask network to obtain to perform semantic change detection. And this multitask network was the best approach that we found. It's much better than the naive approaches that are people's first guesses in this situation. And the large-scale data set that we created was also released openly to the community. Then we looked a little bit into label problems. So we looked at noisy labels and how to mitigate the effect of this bias and the particularities of how the annotations were generated. We proposed the guided anisotropic diffusion to better transfer edge details from a guide image or many guide images to the predictions, the semantic segmentations. And we also performed completely weakly supervised learning using image level labels to perform semantic segmentation successfully with this attention layer and a two-headed network. Finally, we proposed a domain adaptation method that was used for transferring knowledge between different types of natural catastrophe for change detection, but we also validated it in other computer vision tasks. Much of the work I presented today was presented in national and mainly international conferences and one journal paper. Also, I released openly 2 data sets and the code for some of the work that I've done. When it comes to how to continue this work in the future, my suggestions are, first, multitemporal extensions of the ideas that I've proposed. Some of this, there have been works that have extended these specific networks using this data set with long short-term memory cells by Maria Vakalopoulou. And then handling time series of variable lengths to maximize the available information to predict, to detect the changes. It would also be interesting to see how these techniques fare when we're dealing with multimodal data, because we cannot simply apply the same operations to SAR images, for example, and Rgb images. The techniques probably, if I had to guess, they would work with SAR images as long as they're trained and there is enough data. But this remains to be tested. As far as I know, I'm not sure if it has been done yet. And SAR images, for example, they are more robust to weather effects. And also, if you have different sorts of sources of data, you can like kind of cover more weaknesses from one source with the other data sources. Finally, it would be very interesting to see a large-scale deployment of these methods to process the data streams that come from Landsat or Sentinel to satellites, for example. This way we can have like real time, with the delay of a few days maybe, statistics that evolve with over time of all the land masses on Earth. And that could be really interesting to have this automatic analysis of the images that are coming in. I think this could have a very large impact if used correctly.